Chapter 5. A Matter of Color. Edward Wilmot Blyden never really trusted mulattoes, and he wasn't shy about saying so. To the West Indian-born intellectual, who immigrated to Liberia shortly after its independence, the half-whites were traitors to their own African blood. "Here is more Negro hate in those men than they are aware of," he told the Maine State Colonization Society in 1862, "more one of confidence and trust in their mother's blood than they are willing to admit. They cling to the side of their white father." A dozen years later he was pleading with the American Colonization Society to do everything in its power to stop them from going to Liberia. "You are planting here a nest of vipers who hate the country and the race," he argued in a letter to the Society's Secretary William Coppinger. "Do save us from this inundation." Blyden, who proudly described himself as being of ebony hue, claimed that mulattoes held dangerous power, on both sides of the Atlantic, over a race that they secretly despised. "They have set themselves up as representatives and leaders of the colored people of this country, America," he noted, "but, who have no faith in Negro ability to stand alone. They were men who loved to sit in the highest places at public gatherings and conventions held by blacks, but refused to open their homes and shops to those darker than themselves. They had used this power to stymie the very thing Blyden had devoted his life to, integrating a thriving Liberia into a prosperous and civilizing Africa. In the United States, they scatter pestilential teachings about the motherland, counseling poor blacks to remain in America, fearful that immigration will unsettle their hold upon their followers, and eventually leave none in the land low enough to do them honor. And in Liberia, mulattoes did everything in their power to thwart what Blyden felt was the country's destiny as a convergence of Africa and the West, a place where the best of each world would foster black self-rule. They oppose all interior openings, that is, outreach to the interior of Africa, and do not disguise the most impetuous contempt for the natives except in their public speeches for foreign consumption, he informed Coppinger. In Liberia as in America, Blyden believed, a simple racialist reality held true: a small, light-skinned elite worked against the will of the black masses. As with most things Liberia, though, the nation's mulattoes were more complicated than they had first appeared. Blyden would know, he married a daughter of Monrovia's mulatto elite, even though, like the white racial theorists of his day, he held that the mixing of white and black blood produced a race of weak half-breeds. The Liberian color line was not as hard and fast as Blyden made it out to be. It was true that mulattoes dominated the higher reaches of political and economic life in early Liberia, and that many of the darker-skinned settlers resented their influence. But men such as Stephen Benson and Edmund Roy, whose African lineage was evident in their features and skin tone, served as presidents in the first quarter-century after Liberia's independence and were some of the richest men in the country. Indeed, class and birth status, freeborn versus slaveborn, were often just as influential as racial lineage. Nevertheless, the matter of color resonated in every corner of Liberian life. Like many members of the Liberian elite he criticized, Blyden was raised with all the privilege a black man in a 19th-century slave society, in his case, the Danish West Indies island of St. Thomas, could hope for. Both his father, Romeo, a tailor, and his mother, Judith, a schoolteacher, were free and, even rarer, literate and relatively prosperous. On the streets of Synagogue Hill, home to the island's sizable Sephardic Jewish population, the young Blyden played alongside future Confederate Secretary of State Judah Benjamin. Educated in school and tutored at home by his mother, Blyden demonstrated an aptitude for learning, particularly foreign languages. After his family briefly lived in Venezuela in the early 1840s, Blyden returned to St. Thomas fluent in Spanish, and in the grip of an incipient racial consciousness. As he later wrote, he could not help but notice that while the newly liberated Republic of Venezuela had banned slavery, blacks performed the most menial tasks and were treated as second-class citizens. That lesson was further reinforced during his first brief stay in the United States in 1850. Encouraged by John Knox, an American clergyman in St. Thomas, Blyden traveled to New Jersey to attend the theological college at Rutgers. But the scholarly, polyglot 18-year-old's application was turned down by school officials, who did little to disguise that race was the only factor in their decision. After similar experiences with several other schools, Blyden concluded that America was no place for people of color. He considered both a return to St. Thomas and continuing north, to Canada. But the former offered few opportunities for intellectually ambitious individuals, and Canada, to the young black nationalist, was just another place where white men ruled over black men, if a bit more politely. There was, however, another option, according to Knox's American friends, many of them connected to the colonization project, Liberia. They claimed that the world's only black republic other than ill-starred Haiti, was the one place where a talented young black man could realize his potential. For Blyden, the decision was not a difficult one. Like most educated blacks of his day, even abolitionists who considered the white-led colonization movement a conspiracy to drive free blacks from America, Blyden was convinced that benighted Africa was calling out for its long-lost sons to return and lead it out of darkness. His idealism was manifest in a December 1850 article in the New York Colonization Journal, one of the first published pieces in his prodigious career as a polemicist. Liberia, he predicted, would one day include within its limits the dark regions of Ashanti and Dahomey and bring those barbarous tribes under civilized and enlightened influences. 3 weeks later, he was sailing out of Baltimore Harbor. At the time, the shift within Liberian immigration from free blacks and mulattoes to poor and less worldly manumitted slaves, from the likes of Coker and Carey to people like Peyton Skipwith and his family, had already occurred. The sudden surge of free black immigration in 1850 and 1851, a response to passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which put every free black on either side of the Mason-Dixon line at risk of abduction and enslavement, was an aberration. By 1861, when the Civil War effectively put an end to emigration from the United States, manumitted slaves and their descendants outnumbered free blacks and their descendants by roughly 3 to 2. But their numerical strength did not translate into political or economic power. To the ACS, the settlers' two-tier society had from the beginning been rooted in the slave experience. Manumitted slaves, having never been permitted to act or think for themselves, noted Joseph Mecklin in 1831, are in point of industry and intelligence far below the free people of color, and really know not how to provide for their future wants. As usual, the white agent missed the point. True, manumitted slaves were less educated and perhaps unused to fending for themselves, but they were also poorer, in every sense of the word. They came with little money and few connections, to white and free black businessmen back in the States, who might forward them capital or serve as partners in trading enterprises, or to the close-knit mercantile community in Monrovia. By the time the bulk of former slaves arrived in the 1840s and 1850s, the earlier emigrants had already established themselves as an effective ruling class. Merchant wealth bred resentment among ordinary settlers, who felt the elite use their advantaged position to secure power for themselves and deny opportunities to others. While the elite's power and wealth was most noticeable in Monrovia, it also pervaded the smaller settlements of the interior and along the coast, as Augustus Washington noted in an 1854 letter addressed to Frederick Douglass. A teacher and daguerreotypist, Washington was neither an impoverished farmer nor one of the merchant elite but, like Blyden, a member of Liberia's tiny middle class. As Washington explained, in nearly every town and county, there is a one-man power. For that county, a man may hold all the offices of government and besides be a lawyer, merchant, judge, and agent for the American Colonization Society, and, if he chooses, it is not difficult to turn the money and offices of these people into his own coffers. Most settlers would have nodded knowingly at Washington's observation. But they might have added that the big men, the ones who owned the ships and enacted the legislation and lived in the grand houses, were more likely than not mulattoes. This tension had its roots in America, where mulattoes were better situated than blacks as a result of their status as the offspring of white fathers, and occasionally mothers, and because whites were more likely to do business with them. Mulattoes typically had more money, better skills, and a higher level of education. In the South, they were far more likely than darker-skinned blacks to be free. According to the 1850 census, mulattoes constituted 65% of Virginia's free black population but just 22% of its slave force. Though elite blacks and mulattoes in most free African American communities in the United States were bound together by class and white animus, they remained communities apart. They might live together in the black part of town, but in different wards. And while economically successful free black males frequently married into mulatto families, the reverse was a rare occurrence. In late antebellum Cincinnati, for example, more than 90% of mulatto men married their own kind. Suspicion, hostility, and contempt were inevitable. Mulatto haughtiness toward blacks was common enough that even whites noticed it. After visiting a Methodist church in Charleston, a colonization agent noted that the mulatto congregants utterly refused to sit promiscuously with the blacks, and that, in all relations in life, they maintain the same dignified reserve, that the two classes are as totally distinct as it is possible for them to be. In fact, some mulattoes bridled at the idea of immigrating to Liberia, if only because they could not imagine blacks being on equal footing with them. One group of mulattoes went so far as to tell the ACS Secretary Ralph Gurley that they would only go provided they could have a colony to themselves. William Kellogg, a mulatto slave from North Carolina, was even more explicit, telling his master he would prefer slavery in America if freedom in Liberia meant falling into the hands of my inferiors. Many blacks in turn resented and distrusted mulattoes. After the failed Denmark-Vesey slave uprising of 1822, the blacks of Charleston blamed mulattoes for informing the white authorities of the plan. In a speech to that city's elite light-skin-friendly moralist society, Michael Eggert acknowledged the hostility, stating that as mulattoes they faced not only the prejudice of the white man but the deeper hate of our more sable brethren. De Tocqueville picked up on the tension and put it in other context, noting that when quarrels originating in differences of color take place, they, mulattoes, generally side with whites, just as the lackeys of the great in Europe assume the contemptuous airs of nobility towards the lower orders. Still, for most mulattoes and blacks in America, white racism was the larger problem. Thus in Liberia, where there were few whites and, after 1847, none in power, the prejudices mulattoes and blacks brought with them became magnified. The 19-year-old Blyden arrived in Monrovia in January 1851 and immediately his idealism ran up against the realities of Liberian life. He had apprenticed with his father as a tailor but found that his skills were not in demand, the poor could not afford his services while the upper classes had their clothes imported from Paris and New York. So he became a clerk for the merchant, and future president, Stephen Benson, and resumed his studies, between predictable bouts with acclimating sickness. Although housed in a dank one-time grocery store, the newly founded Presbyterian-run Alexander High School Blyden attended was Monrovia's most prestigious educational institution and, in the absence of any college, offered the most advanced education available. Its dozen or so settler pupils, under the tutelage of the Princeton Theological Seminary graduate D.A. Wilson, studied the classical curriculum of the best American secondary schools back home: Greek, Latin, theology, mathematics, geography. With his linguistic gifts, Blyden excelled and within a couple of years was earning money as a tutor and as acting schoolmaster during Wilson's many absences due to fever. Blyden also devoted himself to learning Hebrew, a language he had first heard growing up on Synagogue Hill. He intended to correct the bias of most interpretations of biblical passages relating to Africa and Africans, and in 1857 wrote his first scholarly essay, which refuted the accepted notion that the curse on Noah's son Ham was justification for the enslavement of the Negro race. He learned a more profound lesson outside of school, one that put him on a collision course with the country's mulatto elite. For all of his budding intellectual convictions about African destiny and his growing suspicion that a foreign race had taught the black man a thoroughly injurious and false version of his heritage, he had no engagement with the real-life natives in Monrovia or the hinterland. He still subscribed to the notion of the settlers' divinely sanctioned mission to bring civilization to the Dark Continent. In a letter to Knox, he expressed approval of an 1852 militia expedition against the crew, noting that the enemy had been subdued, before reflexively adding, "Surely, God is on our side." Like most Liberian men under 40, Blyden, though he was physically unprepossessing, was expected to shoulder his share of the Republic's defense. In 1853, a year after praising the victory over the crew, he was recruited into the militia for a punitive expedition against the rebellious Phi, a tribe to the north that would resist paying taxes to Monrovia into the early years of the 20th century. Although vexing, the Phi commanded the settlers' respect. They were one of the few African peoples to develop their own system of writing independent of Arabic or European languages. Br. President Benson even claimed that the Phi were intellectually in advance of many of the immigrants to this country from the United States. Blyden was impressed as well. On the military expedition, Blyden found the Phi capital, remarkably fortified, a testament to the inventive genius of the natives and a refutation of the unfairness of those who represented the native Africans as naturally indolent, and living in a state of ease and supineness. Blyden never looked back from this first encounter with natives. He began to venture into the hinterland to learn more about the peoples there. He was struck by their learning, commenting on the extensive manuscripts in poetry and prose he encountered. As Blyden established himself in settler society, he became editor of the Liberia Herald in 1855, an ordained Presbyterian minister and principal of Alexander High School in 1858, and professor of classics at the newly opened Liberia College in 1862. His respect for native African thought and custom only grew. He praised everything that Europeans and Liberians disparaged, even polygamy, which was especially repellent to the Protestant settlers. Indeed, Blyden came to prefer native culture to settler culture. The natives, Blyden wrote, after a journey to Bopwaru in 1871, were more independent than our independent republic. Interior people have the advantage over us in never having been under foreign masters, in never having imbibed a sense of inferiority or a feeling of self-depreciation. They had never had to look up to white men for anything. They are entirely free from the mental and moral trammels which the touch of the Caucasian has imposed upon us. To Blyden, Liberians had much to learn from the half-naked savages they shunned. As opposed to the acquisitive Western culture of the settlers, which in Blyden's mind was a sure path to poverty, criminality and insanity, the African system of communal property and cooperative effort assured that every member of a community has a home and a sufficiency of food and clothing and other resources of life and for life. Blyden, ever the idealist, believed that Liberia should not be a crude facsimile of a Western nation, but should draw on the native example to create an entirely new kind of society. How shall we make ourselves sublime? He asked readers of the Herald. Not by imitating and thus not only cut a most ungainly figure, but accomplish nothing either for ourselves or the world. Liberians, he charged, had imbibed the white man's contempt for Africa. The notion still common among us is that the most important part of our education or knowledge consists in knowing what foreigners have said about things, about Africa. Hence some of us are found repeating things against ourselves which are thoroughly false and injurious to us because we read them in books. But Liberia had its own manifest destiny beyond the coastal settlements, in Africa's forests and savanna. Expansion into the hinterland promised not just prosperity but life itself for the settlers. Here we are after 50 years, he complained to the ACS, lingering, nay perishing on the coast, our backs are still to be turned on the inviting and healthful interior. His point of view was not, in this respect, unique. European explorers had long emphasized in their writings the contrast between the feverish coast and the salubrious hinterland. But Blyden's goal was different, and profound, the forging of a black empire of both settlers and natives. We must show that we are able to go alone, to carve our own way, he would write upon accepting the presidency of Liberia College in 1881. We must not suppose that the Anglo-Saxon methods are final, we must study our brethren in the interior who knows more than we do the laws of growth for the race. The path forward was plain to see. Liberians should amalgamate with the athletic and vigorous Africans of the interior, particularly the Mandingo, both literally, through marriage, but also in the political sense. I am confident, he wrote, that when this republic comes to herself, I mean her African self, and understands how to cooperate with and utilize her aboriginal population, she will have many things to teach the world for the welfare and advancement of humanity. While informed by his Liberian experience, Blyden's ideas about a global African identity, uniting blacks in the diaspora and on the mother continent, ultimately transcended it. No thinker before him had more forcefully and eloquently framed the idea of an African society that, adapted to the modern world, would provide blacks around the world a path out of political, economic, and, perhaps most important, psychological servitude to the white race. When the Republic fell in 1980, Blyden still represented Liberia's greatest intellectual contribution to global civilization, a pioneer who had made possible the careers and thought of black nationalist thinkers from Marcus Garvey to Kwame Nkrumah. But, in the mid to late 19th century, his influence was yet to be felt, especially in Liberia. He despaired of his adopted nation. It is difficult for me to repress the tears in my eyes when I consider what a noble opportunity Liberia has allowed almost to slip by. Native chiefs of power and widespread influence were ready to place their talents at the service of the Republic, he wrote in 1871. But they were persistently ignored and became enemies. What, then, was the purpose of Liberia? The Republic demonstrated no special or peculiar adaptation to the situation it occupies. It has not given evidence of such distinct individuality as makes a man or a nation interesting and indispensable. Any European colony could have done as much and more on the line we have been pursuing. Blyden blamed Liberia's leadership, who, lacking imagination and statecraft, simply did not understand their opportunity in the work which devolved upon them. He was referring to the mulatto elite, who kept Liberians facing the west. Any forward movement is looked upon with alarm, he told the ACS Secretary Coppinger. They love to settle on the sea-coast in a selfish clanship caring only to rule with no instinctive care for a future which they know they will never enjoy. The issue, to him, was one of race, not class. The mulattoes discourage all earnest patriotism and enterprise which look to the interior, he said, because of their fear of being absorbed by a people, i.e., Africans, they, strangely persist in regarding as a foreign element. It was for that reason, he told Coppinger, as he had told the main colonizationists a decade before, that Liberia's peace and prosperity depend altogether upon keeping mulattoes in America. They will never succeed here or suffer us, black settlers, to succeed. And they can never be welded into the life of this African nation. The bitter 1869 presidential contest gave Blyden hope that the mulatto clique might be losing its grip on power and that the dark-skinned former slaves would finally take their rightful place at the helm of state. The election of Mr. Edmund James Roy, he wrote of his close friend and political ally, in a dispatch to the ACS's African Repository, is the triumph of a party which have been striving for several years to obtain such a position in the country as would enable them to carry out certain principles which they regard as indispensable to the proper growth of that African, i.e., non-mulatto, nationality. Like the Revolution of 1800, the term Thomas Jefferson supporters gave his electoral victory. The 1869 election in Liberia brought to power a man who spoke of overthrowing a political aristocracy, restoring a republic, and returning a government to its people. And just like the wealthy Jefferson, a son of the same ruling class he railed against, Roy seemed at first glance an unusual candidate to lead such a revolution. He was not just an experienced politician, but was said to be the richest man in the country, with a small fleet of ships and lucrative trading contacts on 3 continents. And, aside from the deep sable of his skin, his background was remarkably similar to the leader of the mulatto ruling elite, the venerable first president of the Republic, Joseph Jenkins Roberts. Roy was born in 1815, in the small Ohio town of Newark. His father, according to some accounts, was a runaway slave from Kentucky. Little is known of his mother, other than that she came from Virginia. Seeing the same opportunity as many of his white neighbors, John Roy, a farmer, boatman, and teamster who spent much of his time in Indiana and Illinois, hundreds of miles from his family, speculated in the Midwestern real estate market of the 1820s, leaving his family well taken care of upon his death in 1829. His bookish heir Edward used some of the estate to obtain an exceptional education for a black youth of his day, including a 3-year stint at Ohio University in Athens. A school teacher for a time, Roy then went into business for himself, dealing in sheep and eventually, like his father, dabbling in real estate, picking up discounted properties during the economic panic of the late 1830s and building up a small fortune of his own. He married and fathered 2 children, only to see his wife die shortly after the birth of the second. Reminiscing later in life, he tried to evoke his thoughts at the time of his decision, in the 1840s, to emigrate. "I have steadily had my mind fixed upon a foreign land, since my early youth, a land of African government, for there I believed our elevation would take place." Such reasoning, whether or not it was true to his younger self's motivations, served him politically in Liberia. Fellow émigrés were eager to support a man who claimed that the decision to come to Liberia was inspired by ideals rather than by deteriorating circumstances for free blacks in Ohio in the wake of the bloody, anti-black Cincinnati race riots of 1829. Roy arrived in Monrovia in June 1846 with a developed talent for business and a shipload of goods to sell. Within a few years, he established himself as one of the country's leading merchants, launching the first international shipping line to fly the Liberian flag. Political power in Liberia typically coinciding with economic power, he served as Speaker of the House in 1849 and, for 4 years, in the mid-1860s, as the country's Chief Justice. During this period, he built a political coalition, in both Monrovia and the upriver settlements, among Liberia's growing population of striving former slaves and African recaptives. As he rose to prominence in Liberian life, Roy developed a close personal friendship with Blyden. Both were well-read, which surely contributed to the bond. But they also shared a pride in their blackness. Roy referred to himself as a pure descendant of the Igbo tribe and a resentment of the mercantile elite. Roy agreed with Blyden that the mulatto minority was holding Liberia back from its African destiny. In the 1860s the two established the National True Whig Party, to challenge the ruling Republicans. Roy, who was the more personable of the two and possessed the resources to run the kind of American-style ballyhoo campaigns the electorate expected, became the party's leader. The National True Whig Party did not meet immediate electoral success, but Roy and Blyden nevertheless expanded their base of support to include up-country farmers, the middling classes of Monrovia, and freed slave immigrants like the Skipwiths. In the presidential election of 1869, it was these constituencies that ousted the lackluster James Paine and replaced him with Roy. From the start, Roy and Blyden attempted to turn their idealism and ambitions into policy. In his inaugural address, Roy spoke of a central bank, railroads to the interior, and a public school system. Though not a particularly religious man himself, he invoked the hand of Providence, a required refrain in public speech. But this did not lessen the impact of his overt references to black pride as the guiding principle of his administration. "It is our duty," he told the assembled citizens and dignitaries in front of Government House, to prove that the mental and other disabilities under which the Negro labors as a result of his service antecedents are not inherent, but that they are solely the result of circumstances, to be altogether removed when those circumstances are altered. Roy proclaimed that he would redirect the country's energies toward the interior, which was also standard political cant for Monrovia politicians, Liberia's own city upon a hill theme, but gave it a special edge. I believe that the object of our residence on this coast is to bear some humble part in bringing out the fulfillment of that cheering prophecy, that Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God. To the light-skinned members of his audience, he then issued a veiled warning. Who among us, he said, will prove recreant to a trust of such magnitude, and involving such important consequences? Blyden, who no doubt had helped to write the speech, was delighted, especially by Roy's plan for schools in native villages. Shortly after the inauguration, he headed up country, a one-man legation to the chiefs of Bapuru, a key administrative and trade center in the near hinterland, where he spread the good word that a new day had dawned in Monrovia and a new era in settler-native relations had begun. But change in Monrovia was not immediately forthcoming. The election had produced a divided government, Republicans still controlled the Senate, and the makings of a constitutional crisis. On the same ballot that put Roy in the executive mansion was an amendment that would extend the presidential term from 2 years to 4 and double the terms of senators and representatives. These were popular ideas. Most Liberians believed that the 2-year election cycle produced a non-stop campaign that hampered good governance, and, moreover, were sensitive to white criticism that the country was something of a political circus. The measure passed in a landslide since both Republican and Whig voters expected their candidates to win. When Roy came out on top, however, the Republican Senate balked, putting the measure on the ballot again in a special plebiscite. But the votes on the second referendum were never counted, at least publicly. Instead, the Senate seized the ballots and then issued a resolution declaring the amendment had not received the 2/3 necessary for passage. Roy, with a typical Liberian emphasis on legal niceties, noted the word resolution in the Senate's declaration and cited his own constitutional right to veto such legislative decisions. He then declared the second referendum null and void and made sure the first was put into effect. But the Republicans, the party of the mulatto mercantile elite, were determined to press forward. They persuaded Roberts to return to political life and run for the presidency in May 1871, despite the fact that Roy had declared such an election, just 2 years after his own, a violation of the amended Constitution. Running unopposed, Liberia's founding father won, then left for Europe to wait out the long period the Constitution called for between election and inauguration on the first Monday of the following year. Even with Roberts gone, however, a political showdown, and perhaps even an outbreak of violence, seemed inevitable. "Matters stand in a very serious condition here," reported the Monrovia correspondent of Britain's African Times. "The country is in a great uproar, every man seems to have the law in his hands." In Monrovia's close-knit elite society, few secrets stayed that way for long. It had been public knowledge for some time that Blyden's 15-year-old marriage to Sarah Yates was an unhappy one. The race-proud Blyden had, for reasons unknown, but which can be guessed at, wedded the niece of one of the wealthiest mulatto businessmen in Monrovia who was also the country's vice president. The match had not been a congenial one. The barely literate Sarah showed little interest in her husband's intellectual pursuits and could not have been pleased at Blyden's genteel poverty or utter lack of commercial ambition, a conspicuous shortcoming in Liberia's high society. Blyden chose to put a political spin on things, claiming that the discord was due to his wife being more loyal to her clan than to her husband. Indeed, in a letter to a friend in the United States, he depicted Sarah as an enemy in his home. "I live among an unsympathetic people, and, I regret to say, an unsympathizing family," he wrote. "My wife seems entirely unimprovable. She is of the mind and temperament of the people around her. I am persecuted outside but more inside. Uncongenial, incompatible, unsympathetic, my wife makes the burden of my life sore and heavy." Blyden's opinion of the First Lady, Mrs. Edward Roy, was more favorable. He once told Roy he respected him for choosing a wife from the ranks of black settlers, something his wealthier dark-skinned predecessors had not done. And, indeed, Blyden enjoyed a close relationship with the First Lady, which, given his own marital problems, left him open to charges from Republicans that he had been carrying on an affair with her. In the heated political atmosphere of the disputed election, the charges led to violence, as a mob claiming to stand up for the president's honor, and made up of what Blyden called 40 poverty-stricken and ignorant blacks, put a rope around Blyden's neck and dragged him through the streets of Monrovia. Blyden said the mob was mulatto-incited. But some observers saw Roy's hand in it, and not because he believed the rumors of an affair, but because he saw Blyden as a means to deflect mulatto anger away from himself. Roy may have felt he had no choice. Long a polarizing figure in Liberian politics, Blyden got caught up in a controversy when a confidential letter to the New York Colonization Society, the professor's benefactor, was printed in the Smithsonian Institution's annual report for 1870 and reprinted in Monrovia newspapers. While Blyden's disdain for the merchant elite was hardly a secret, the contents of the letter were especially inflammatory. In it, Blyden urged American philanthropists to cut off funding to mulatto students. Citing statistical evidence, Blyden argued that the death rate among mulattoes was so high that it made little sense to pay for their education. That and claims that decadent mulattoes in important positions were responsible for Liberia's want of enterprise and progress produced such outrage that Roy opted to distance himself from his longtime friend and ally. In the end, Blyden was saved from a lynching by the last-minute intervention of another powerful friend, the former President Daniel Warner, who urged him, for his own safety, to leave the country. Blyden needed little persuading. He fled to Sierra Leone, where, for 2 years, he edited a Freetown paper and served as agent to the interior for the local colonial government. The forced absence, while no doubt upsetting to a man who considered himself a Liberian patriot, saved his life. Roy's expansive plans were also expensive ones, especially for a government as impoverished as Liberia's. Virtually all of the country's revenue came from import and export duties and, as the legislature was dominated by merchants who paid these customs, collection was haphazard and payment usually honored in the breach. So Roy tried a different tack. All civilized governments, he lectured the legislature, ran a public debt, which they converted into a sort of available capital and circulate as money upon the faith of the government which renders itself worthy of credit. Why shouldn't Africa's only black republic do likewise? But opposition lawmakers refused to authorize a loan. Undeterred, in the summer of 1871, shortly after Blyden's escape to Sierra Leone, Roy contacted Liberia's representative in London, David Chinery, to make inquiries in the city's financial markets. Essentially an ambassador for hire, Chinery, a British national, operated on the fringes of London's diplomatic and banking circles. He wrote Roy to say that he had found willing bankers. The president then dispatched 2 high-level allies, House Speaker W. S. Anderson and Interior Secretary H. W. Johnson, to conclude the negotiations for a $500,000 loan. Br. Anderson and Johnson were out of their depth in the sophisticated and complex world of international finance. The deal they agreed to was a terrible one by any standard. Citing Liberia's precarious finances, and, no doubt, charging an unstated premium on a loan destined for a black republic, the bankers demanded a discount of 30% merely for extending the loan. They also required that 3 years' interest be paid up front. This meant that Anderson and Johnson would return home with less than half the borrowed amount. Moreover, with interest set at a high 7% over 15 years, and on the full $500,000, the Liberian government would end up paying more than $650,000 for a payment of less than $250,000. When word of the extortionate terms reached Liberia, the political classes erupted in anger, especially as rumors began to circulate that Roy, who had gone to London to ink the deal, had siphoned off another $50,000 for himself. Even when it turned out the money had been spent on government supplies, the president's critics were not placated. Roberts labeled the purchases inferior and useless and paid for in excess of their market value. Regardless, the spent funds made it impossible for the Liberian government to back out of the deal. The whole episode, an indignant Roberts said, consisted of charges, peculations and frauds unparalleled, I presume, in any public loan transaction of modern times. Roy's return to Liberia at the beginning of October precipitated a crisis over the very legitimacy of his presidency. Citing the alleged repeal of the constitutional amendment extending the presidential term and emboldened by their victory in the strange election of the previous May, Roberts and his Republican supporters insisted that Roy's term would come to an end in January 1872. When the president issued a proclamation that he intended to serve 4 full years in office, his opponents hinted darkly that Roy was planning a Latin American-style coup and on becoming the dictator of Liberia. Roy countered that it was the Republicans who were the coup plotters. As the charges flew, both sides began to arm themselves in Monrovia and the outlying settlements, each side insisting it was acting in defense of the Constitution. Who started the violence is, like so much else, lost to history. The surviving accounts, largely written by anti-Roy forces, claim that the president's supporters moved first, forcibly seizing a Monrovia bank owned by a pro-Republican upriver cooperative. The rioting that followed engulfed the capital and led to an armed siege of the president's house. Eyewitnesses claimed that they saw Roy himself lobbing grenades at the crowd from an upstairs window. But after the mob fired a cannon into the house, resistance collapsed. The rioters ransacked the place, seizing Roy and his eldest son, who served as the Treasury Secretary. While the crowd escorted the Roys to jail, the legislature met in joint session. Discussion was heated, even though Roy had few defenders left. Impeachment, they decided, was too slow a process, and promised to divide the country further. Instead, they took the unconstitutional step of deposing the president. In public speeches, anti-Roy politicians cited him for contracting a foreign loan contrary to the law, distributing arms and munitions of war to crush the liberties of the people and contrary to the Constitution, proclaiming himself president for 4 years, although elected for only 2 years. The Republicans, careful, like all Liberians, to keep up appearances and ward off criticism from Washington and the capitals of Europe, to maintain their pride in their commerce, decided they needed constitutional cover for their actions. So they put Roy and most of his cabinet on trial for treason. But when the inevitable guilty verdict and hanging sentence came down on February 10, 1872, the results triggered a still greater embarrassment for the young republic. In the gathering darkness of the near-moonless Saturday night of February 10, the Roys broke through a second-floor window of Monrovia's stone courthouse and slid to the ground on a rope that a supporter of Edward Jr.'s had smuggled into his cell. The two then made their way to the outskirts of Monrovia, where they attempted to bribe some crew boatman to row them to the English mail steamer anchored in the waters off Cape Mesurado. But word of the escape had already spread and the crewmen quickly recognized the burly, balding ex-president. They gave chase. Roy and his son, one step ahead of them, disappeared into the jungle and then became separated. Through the night and into the morning a posse searched the edge of the Cape as each Roy, father and son, listened to the muffled voices of their pursuers above the crashing Atlantic surf and contemplated his next move. In the early afternoon, the elder Roy, perhaps betting that his pursuers were waiting in the shade to avoid the dry season sun, took his chance. A witness in Crewtown said he saw a naked man emerge from the bushes sometime between 2 and 3, with something like a bag about his waist. Hoping that his dark skin and bulky build would let him pass for a crewman out for a swim, Roy had stripped down to a breechcloth and dived into the surf, heading for the steamer. He didn't make it. A gathering crowd on the beach watched him slowly go under. Some said they heard shots ring out. Most, however, were convinced he was brought down by gold coins in the bag strapped around his waist. The younger Roy was apprehended a couple of hours later, cowering in the bush. He was eventually acquitted of treason but fled for England before a second trial, for misconduct in office, could begin. As for his father, a team of crewmen sent to recover his body found no bag of gold, setting off a new controversy. Roy's supporters claimed that the president was a martyr, innocently gunned down as he fled his tormentors. But opponents replied that the crewmen must have made off with the loot. And, indeed, one of them, who swore that he had been cheated of his share, admitted as much to Liberian authorities weeks later. Whatever the case, the drowning cast a pall over Monrovia's citizenry. The long-excited passions of the populace seemed to have lost all their recent vehemence on that holy Sabbath afternoon, a correspondent for the African Repository reported, as following in silence the lifeless body of him, once their ruler, so lamentably misled, so deplorably ambitious, born to the prison which, scarcely 24 hours before, he had left, animated doubtless by most sanguine hopes. So perished the deposed President E.J. Roy, 5th President of Liberia. Roy's death reverberated across Liberia. In the upriver settlements, black Liberians met to discuss secession in view of what they believed was an illegal usurpation of power by the mulatto elite. And while these discussions led nowhere, the former president's true Whig supporters never accepted the legitimacy of the Roberts administration. The Liberia College philosophy professor and Blyden ally Alexander Crummell, whose son, a Roy supporter, was briefly imprisoned during the coup, denounced the whole affair as an uprising of a whole class of persons, who are opposed to culture, improvement, and native elevation. These men have now at last made a deed set against civilization, enlightenment, and mission. Roberts, who took office uneventfully in January 1872, proposed reconciliation with the true Whigs, recognizing that, while defeated, they nevertheless represented a growing force in Liberian politics. In his inaugural address, he spoke of meeting them halfway on the native question that had divided the black nationalists from the mulattoes, though his vision was traditionally condescending. It is extremely desirable that the whole aboriginal population of the Republic should be drawn as rapidly as possible within the circle of civilization, he declared, and be fitted by suitable educational training for all duties of civil and social life, and thus too we shall be exerting a hallowed influence upon the tribes of our far interior. But when the new president tried to recruit the Whigs' intellectual leader as his Secretary of State, Blyden, now back in Monrovia, turned him down, describing the Republican-led government as inefficient and imbecile. Blyden preferred to continue his educational work among the natives. The stark divisions between black working-class and mulatto elite were beginning to dissipate even as the passions quieted. With increasing intermarriage between the two groups, it became more and more difficult to make distinctions based on skin color. As a discrete political and economic group, the mulattoes were becoming no more, even if their light skin would remain a badge of elite distinction and their notion of a settler civilization beset by savage natives would inform Liberian self-conception for generations to come. After their dramatic losses in the 1878 elections and their decision to endorse the true Whig candidate for president 4 years later, the Republicans were effectively done as a viable party, their elitist politics no longer viable against the rising populist true Whig machine. Roy may have met an untimely end, but the political party he founded survived him in spectacular fashion. The true Whigs maintained a one-party grip on power into the late 20th century, the longest reign for a political party in modern world history. It would require a bloody native-led coup to finally force them out. The party's final leader, like its first, would die violently while still in office. Long before that circle closed, Liberians of all political stripes had to deal with the consequences of the disastrous royal loan, a financial hole out of which their government would not dig itself until early in the 20th century. After decades of conflict with the natives, harassment by European traders, and political strife, this fiscal burden was only the latest existential threat to the young republic. Graver ones would soon follow.